Grace Mitchell lived a peaceful life in the coastal town of Harbor Bay, Maine, where the locals knew her as the owner of the Tranquil waterfront yoga studio. Her gentle demeanor and graceful movements masked a lifetime of discipline and training that few could comprehend. The quiet strength she carried within her was evident to those who watched closely, though none could have guessed the true extent of her capabilities. The morning sun painted golden streaks across the weathered boardwalk as Grace moved through her daily routine with practiced precision. Her studio, Serenity Flow, occupied an old converted boathouse at the edge of the harbor, its weathered blue exterior and white trim blending seamlessly with the maritime charm of the town. The sound of waves lapping against the wooden pylons created a natural rhythm that accompanied her movements as she prepared for the day's first class. Inside, the studio was a testament to her attention to detail. Polished hardwood floors gleamed in the early morning light that streamed through the large windows overlooking the harbor. The walls, painted in soft, calming blues and greens, were adorned with minimalist artwork depicting ocean waves and Zen gardens. Everything had its place, every element carefully chosen to create an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. Grace moved with fluid grace as she arranged the yoga mats in perfect rows, each one aligned with mathematical precision. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid that hung down her back, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that held a depth of experience few noticed. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from years of rigorous training and self-discipline, though her students simply attributed it to her expertise as a yoga instructor. The locals who attended her classes saw only what she allowed them to see, a skilled teacher who had moved to Harbor Bay 3 years ago seeking a quieter life. They appreciated her patient instruction, her ability to help them find balance and strength through movement, but they never questioned what lay beneath her serene exterior. To them, she was simply Grace, the yoga instructor who lived alone in the apartment above her studio, who smiled softly at passers-by and always had a kind word for everyone she met. But there was more to Grace than met the eye. Behind her gentle demeanor lay years of intensive martial arts training, countless hours spent in dojos across the world, and a mastery of self-defense techniques that she had honed to perfection. She had studied under some of the most renowned masters in various disciplines, earning black belts in multiple styles and competing at elite levels before choosing to step away from that world. Her current life was a deliberate choice, a conscious decision to embrace peace while maintaining the warrior spirit that had been ingrained in her since childhood. The morning classes went by smoothly, filled with the usual mix of local residents and summer tourists. Grace guided them through their poses with quiet authority, her voice calm and assured as she helped them find their balance and strength. She took particular pride in helping her students discover their own inner power, though she never pushed them beyond their comfortable limits. The irony of teaching others to find strength through gentleness wasn't lost on her. Between classes, Grace would often stand at the large windows, watching the fishing boats bob gently in the harbor. The rhythmic movement of the water helped center her thoughts, bringing her back to the present moment when memories of her past training threatened to surface. She had chosen Harbor Bay carefully, attracted to its small-town atmosphere and the way the community looked out for its own. Here she had found a place where she could maintain her practice while living a life of relative anonymity. The locals had their theories about her, of course. Small towns always bred curiosity about newcomers, and Grace was no exception. Some speculated that she had left behind a high-pressure career in the city, while others wondered if she was recovering from some personal tragedy. None of their guesses came close to the truth, and Grace preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that true strength often lay in knowing when to remain silent. Her apartment above the studio reflected the same minimalist aesthetic as the space below, though with subtle differences that hinted at her other life. Hidden behind the clean lines and sparse furnishings were elements that would seem out of place to casual observers. A collection of books on advanced martial arts techniques tucked away on high shelves, a small room devoted to private training, and equipment that spoke to a discipline far beyond yoga practice. In the evenings, after the last student had left and the studio was quiet, Grace would often train alone. These private sessions were different from the gentle flows she taught during the day. Her movements became sharper, more focused, as she worked through complex combinations of strikes and defensive maneuvers. The peaceful yoga instructor transformed into something else entirely, a precisely tuned instrument of controlled power and speed. It was during these solitary training sessions that Grace felt most like herself, able to fully embrace both aspects of her nature, the nurturing teacher and the skilled fighter. She had spent years learning to balance these seemingly contradictory elements of her personality, understanding that true mastery came not from dominating others, but from achieving harmony within oneself. The townspeople of Harbour Bay had come to accept Grace as part of their community, though they never quite understood her. They appreciated her contributions to local events, her willingness to offer free classes to seniors and at-risk youth, and the way she had restored the old boathouse into something beautiful. But there was always something about her that kept them at a respectful distance, an invisible barrier that few tried to cross. Some noticed the way she moved, with a grace that seemed almost too perfect, too controlled. Others caught glimpses of a different side of her when she thought no one was watching, moments when her gentle demeanor gave way to something more focused, more intense. But these observations remained unspoken, filed away as curiosities about the quiet woman who had made their town her home. As summer began to fade into autumn, Grace found herself settling into the rhythm of Harbour Bay life with increasing comfort. The tourist season was winding down, leaving behind the regular year-round residents who formed the core of her classes. She knew each of them by name, understood their strengths and limitations, and took quiet satisfaction in watching their progress. This was the life she had chosen, far removed from the competitive dojos and intensive training camps of her past. Yet even as she embraced this peaceful existence, Grace never let her guard down completely. Years of training had taught her to remain aware of her surroundings, to notice the subtle shifts in energy that might signal approaching danger. It was an instinct she couldn't fully suppress, nor did she want to. She knew that true peace came not from ignoring the possibility of conflict, but from being prepared for it while choosing a path of harmony. The coastal town of Harbour Bay was known for its rugged beauty, a place where the line between land and sea blurred in a constant dance of tides and seasons. The historic district, with its weathered, clapboard buildings and narrow cobblestone streets, told stories of generations of fishermen and seafaring folk who had called this place home. Grace's studio sat at the edge of this district, where the old harbour met the newer developments that had sprung up to accommodate the town's growing popularity as a tourist destination. Fall was settling over Harbour Bay, painting the maple trees. Along Main Street, in brilliant shades of red and gold, the morning air carried a crisp edge that spoke of approaching winter, and the summer crowds had dwindled to a steady trickle of weekend visitors. Local fishermen prepared their boats for the changing seasons, while shop owners began displaying autumn decorations in their windows. Grace's morning routine remained unchanged, despite the shifting seasons. She would wake before dawn, spending the quiet hours in meditation and private practice before preparing the studio for her first class. The large windows of her studio captured the early morning light, creating patterns on the hardwood floors that seemed to dance with her movements as she went about her preparations. The studio had become more than just a business. It was a sanctuary for many of the town's residents. Regular students spoke of the sense of peace they found within its walls, attributing it to Grace's careful attention to creating the right environment. The salt air and gentle sound of waves provided a natural backdrop to the calm atmosphere she cultivated. Among her regular students was Sarah Henderson, the town librarian, who attended the morning classes religiously. Sarah was one of the few people in Harbor Bay who had made an effort to know Grace beyond her role as an instructor. She was observant enough to notice the subtle details others missed, the way Grace sometimes moved with an efficiency that seemed almost too precise, or how her eyes would occasionally scan a room as if assessing potential threats. "There's something different about you," Sarah had once commented after class, as they shared tea in the small sitting area Grace had created near the studio's entrance. "You remind me of my brother who served in the military. Always aware, always ready." Grace had simply smiled in response, neither confirming nor denying the observation, but something in her eyes had told Sarah she wasn't far from the truth. The town itself had its own rhythm, one that Grace had come to appreciate deeply. The fishing boats would head out before dawn, their lights dotting the harbor like floating stars. The morning crowd at Harbor Coffee, the local cafe just down the street from her studio, consisted mainly of fishermen's wives and early-rising business owners. Grace would often stop there after her first class, enjoying a moment of quiet conversation with Martha, the elderly owner who treated everyone like family. Martha had taken a particular liking to Grace, often setting aside a fresh blueberry muffin for her regular morning visit. "You've got old eyes and a young face," Martha had told her once, with the directness that came from decades of watching people come and go through her cafe. "Seen a lot, haven't you?" Grace had accepted both the muffin and the observation with a gentle smile, appreciating Martha's insight while maintaining her privacy. The apartment above the studio had become Grace's true home, more so than any place she had lived in the past decade. The space was modest but efficient, with large windows that offered views of both the harbor and the main street below. She had arranged her living space with the same attention to detail that characterized her studio. Everything had its place, and every item served a purpose. Hidden within this carefully curated space were reminders of her other life. A locked cabinet in her bedroom contained certificates of mastery from various martial arts disciplines, photographs of training sessions with renowned instructors, and medals from competitions she had won before choosing to step away from that world. These weren't displayed, but kept as private reminders of the path that had led her to Harbor Bay. In the small room she used for private training, a heavy bag hung in one corner, and traditional training weapons were stored discreetly in a custom-built cabinet. The room's windows were fitted with privacy film that allowed light in, while preventing anyone from seeing inside. Here, in the early morning hours or late at night, Grace maintained her more intensive training regimen, keeping her skills sharp, even as she embraced a quieter life. The townspeople had their own theories about Grace, as small-town residents often did about newcomers who kept to themselves. Some thought she might be recovering from a difficult divorce. Others speculated about a high-pressure career she had left behind. The more romantic souls among them imagined she was writing a novel or pursuing some other artistic endeavor. None of their speculation came close to the truth, but Grace found their harmless theories amusing. The group circled the waterfront area twice before parking their bikes in front of Harbor Coffee. Their arrival sent ripples of unease through the town's usual calm. Martha, the cafe owner, watched with concern as the riders dismounted, their boots heavy on the weathered boardwalk. They were an intimidating presence, men and women whose very posture seemed designed to project threat and dominance. Her integration into the community had been gradual and deliberate. She volunteered at local events, offered free classes for seniors at the community center, and participated in beach cleanup efforts. These activities allowed her to be involved while maintaining the comfortable distance she preferred. Her contributions were appreciated, but she never sought recognition or attempted to place herself at the center of attention. The changing seasons brought subtle shifts to the town's character. As autumn deepened, the tourist shops began closing earlier, and the weekend crowds grew smaller. The locals reclaimed their town, settling into the quieter rhythms of the off-season. Grace particularly enjoyed this time of year, when the morning mist would roll in from the ocean, wrapping the town in an ethereal blanket that seemed to mute all sound. During these autumn days, Grace would sometimes take long walks along the beach after her last class, watching the sun set over the water. These solitary moments allowed her to reflect on the path that had brought her to Harbor Bay. She thought about the years of training, the competitions, the intensive study under various masters who had helped shape her into who she was. While she had chosen to step away from that world, the discipline and awareness it had instilled in her remained constant companions. The beach walks also served as an opportunity to maintain her situational awareness, a habit so deeply ingrained it had become second nature. She noticed everything: the regular evening joggers, the teenagers who gathered at certain spots along the beach, the fishing boats returning to harbor. This awareness wasn't born of paranoia, but of training and experience, a skill that had saved her life more than once in the past. As the days grew shorter and the evening chill became more pronounced, Grace began preparing the studio for the winter season. She added extra heaters, brought in more blankets for the final relaxation portion of her classes, and adjusted the class schedule to accommodate the earlier sunset. These changes were made with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, each decision carefully considered and implemented with precision. Harbor Bay was entering its quietest season, a time when the community drew closer together and the pace of life slowed even further. Grace had come to appreciate these cycles, finding in them a natural reflection of the balance she sought to maintain in her own life. Yet even as she embraced the peace of her chosen home, she remained ready, knowing that true preparation meant being ready for whatever might come, even in the most unexpected moments. The first signs of trouble arrived with the distant rumble of motorcycles, their engines echoing off the old buildings of Harbor Bay's waterfront district. It was an unusual sound in the quiet coastal town, especially during the off-season when tourist traffic had dwindled to almost nothing. The noise grew louder, more insistent, disrupting the peaceful atmosphere that typically characterized the harbor area. Grace was in the middle of her afternoon class when the first bikes roared past her studio. She noticed the way the sound made her students flinch, their concentration broken by the unexpected intrusion. Without missing a beat, she guided them back to their practice, her voice remaining calm and steady even as her senses heightened, analyzing the situation with practiced awareness. Through the large windows, she caught glimpses of the riders as they passed, a group of at least 8 motorcycles, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. They weren't the typical weekend riders who sometimes visited Harbor Bay during the summer months. These bikes were modified for maximum noise, their riders clad in leather, adorned with patches that spoke of affiliations Grace recognized from her years of training in various cities. Grace continued her class without interruption, but her attention remained split between her students and the scene unfolding outside. She observed the way the group positioned themselves, noting their formation and the subtle hierarchies evident in their behavior. The leader, a tall woman with flame-red hair and multiple facial piercings, seemed to be conducting some sort of surveillance, her eyes scanning the storefronts with calculated interest. As the class ended and her students filed out, Grace heard fragments of conversation about the newcomers. Words like trouble and gang floated through the air, mixing with the continued rumble of motorcycle engines as other riders joined the initial group. The nervous energy in the town was palpable, a current of tension running beneath the surface of normal activity. Sarah Henderson, lingering after class as she often did, voiced what many were thinking. "They're not just passing through, are they?" she asked quietly, watching as more bikes arrived. Grace shook her head slightly, her movements deliberate as she stored away the yoga mats. "No," she replied, "they're not." There was something in her tone that made Sarah look at her sharply, but Grace had already turned away, her attention focused on the growing crowd outside. The remainder of the afternoon brought more arrivals, additional motorcycles and a few beaten-up cars that seemed to be part of the same group. The peaceful harbour area had transformed into something else entirely, the air thick with tension and the smell of exhaust. The local shops began closing early, their owners hurrying home as the sun began to set. Grace watched it all from her studio, her practiced eye noting details that others might miss. She saw the way the group was establishing territory, their positioning strategic rather than random. She recognized the subtle signals passed between members, the way they were, sizing up the town and its residents. This wasn't a random stop on a longer journey. They had chosen Harbour Bay for a reason. As evening approached, the group's presence became more assertive. Their laughter grew louder, their movements more aggressive. A few of them entered Martha's cafe, their manner deliberately intimidating as they ordered coffee and food. Martha served them with rigid politeness, her usual warm demeanor replaced by cautious efficiency. Grace began preparing for her evening class, though she suspected attendance would be lower than usual. She was right. Only 3 students showed up, all of them regulars who lived within walking distance. She conducted the class as normal, but positioned herself so she could maintain a clear view of the street through the windows. The session was interrupted twice by the roar of engines. As motorcycles raced past the studio, their riders revving unnecessarily loud as they passed the windows. Grace noticed how her students jumped at each pass, their concentration broken by the intrusive noise. She guided them through their practice with extra care, helping them find their center despite the disruptions. After the last student left, Grace remained in the studio, going through her closing routine with deliberate attention. Through the windows, she could see the group had grown larger, now numbering at least 20 people. They had effectively taken over the small parking area near the harbour, their bikes and vehicles creating a barrier between the water and the town. The red-haired leader, whom Grace had been observing throughout the day, was now openly walking the streets with 2 others, pausing to look closely at each business. When they passed the studio, Grace felt the woman's gaze lingering on the space, assessing. Their eyes met briefly through the window, and Grace allowed herself to be seen as nothing more than what she appeared, a yoga instructor preparing to close for the day. But beneath her calm exterior, Grace's mind was working, analyzing, and preparing. She recognized the signs of a group planning to establish a permanent presence, the way they were moving through the town, their growing numbers, the strategic positioning, all pointed to a calculated takeover rather than a temporary stop. As darkness fell over Harbour Bay, the atmosphere grew more menacing. The sound of breaking glass somewhere down the street was followed by raucous laughter. Car alarms began going off at random intervals, and the few residents still out hurried to their destinations, heads down, trying to avoid attention. Grace finished her closing routine and climbed the stairs to her apartment above the studio. From her windows, she had a clear view of the harbour and the group below. She watched as they set up what appeared to be a makeshift camp, complete with portable lights and music playing from vehicle speakers. Their presence was a deliberate statement. They were claiming territory, establishing dominance over the peaceful town. The night brought more arrivals, more noise, more disruption to the quiet life of Harbour Bay. Grace stood at her window, observing it all with the patience and attention to detail that had been drilled into her through years of training. She knew that the peace she had found in this town was about to be tested, and she began to prepare herself for what might come next. "Nice place," Phoenix said finally. "Real nice. Be a shame if anything happened to it." The threat was delivered almost casually, but her eyes remained hard. "We should talk about protection. These are dangerous times." Grace inclined her head slightly. "Thank you for your concern," she replied, her voice steady. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we're in the middle of a session." Phoenix's lips curved into a cold smile. "We'll talk later," she said, turning to leave. She paused in the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. "Don't go anywhere." The last words were delivered with a hint of amusement, as if she was sharing a private joke. After they left, Grace guided her shaken students through the remainder of the class, adapting the final sequences to help calm their nerves. As they rolled up their mats, she could see the fear in their eyes, hear it in their whispered conversations about what they had witnessed. Sarah lingered after the others had gone, helping Grace clean the muddy footprints from the floor. "You're not afraid of them," she said. It wasn't a question. "You've dealt with people like this before, haven't you?" Grace wrung out the cleaning cloth, her movements precise and controlled. "Fear doesn't help in these situations," she replied carefully. "It only clouds judgment." Sarah watched her for a moment longer, then nodded as if something had been confirmed. "Be careful," she said finally, gathering her things to leave. "They're planning something big. I can feel it." Grace stood at the window after Sarah left, watching as Phoenix and her crew moved through the town with growing boldness. They were establishing their presence, marking their territory like predators in a new hunting ground. But predators weren't always at the top of the food chain, and appearances could be deceiving, something Grace knew all too well. As the day progressed, Harbor Bay descended further into a state of barely controlled chaos. The bikers had spread throughout the town, their presence growing more invasive with each passing hour. Grace observed from her studio as they moved in small groups, entering shops at will, helping themselves to whatever caught their fancy. The local residents hurried past with downcast eyes, trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Phoenix had established her command center in front of Harbor Coffee, holding court from a makeshift throne fashioned from an old captain's chair, taken from one of the docked boats. She watched over her domain with calculated satisfaction, directing her crew with subtle gestures and quiet commands. The efficiency of their operations spoke of experience. This wasn't their first takeover of a small town. Grace maintained her class schedule, though attendance had dwindled to just a handful of dedicated students. Each session was interrupted at least once by members of Phoenix's crew, who seemed to take pleasure in disrupting the peaceful atmosphere. They would swagger in, make crude comments, and leave muddy boot prints across the floor. But Grace never reacted beyond maintaining her professional demeanor. During the afternoon lull between classes, Martha slipped into the studio, her usually cheerful face drawn with worry. "They've taken over the cafe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Said I need to pay them protection money if I want to keep operating. When I refused, they started breaking things." She held up her hands, which were shaking. "I don't know what to do, Grace." Grace guided the older woman to the small seating area, preparing her a cup of the calming tea she kept for students. "Have they hurt anyone?" she asked quietly, her mind already working through scenarios and possibilities. Martha shook her head. "Not yet, but it's coming. I can feel it. They're getting bolder, more aggressive. This morning they cornered young Tommy Peterson when he tried to open the bookstore. Made him hand over all the cash in the register, then told him he needs to pay them weekly if he wants to stay in business." As Martha spoke, Grace heard the growing roar of motorcycles outside. Through the window, she watched as more riders arrived, their bikes modified for maximum intimidation with matte black paint and straight pipes that shattered the coastal calm with their noise. The newcomers were different from the first wave, harder looking, more obviously armed. "They're bringing in reinforcements," Grace observed, her voice low and controlled. "They're planning to stay." Martha's hands tightened around her teacup. "The police say they can't do anything, that they don't have enough officers to handle. A group this size, they've advised us to just cooperate, give them what they want until help can arrive from the state." Grace's expression remained neutral, but her mind was racing. She had seen this pattern before in other places, small towns targeted specifically because of their limited law enforcement resources. The gangs would move in quickly, establish control through intimidation, and by the time help arrived, they would have such a firm grip on the community that dislodging them would be nearly impossible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the studio windows as Grace walked Martha to the door. Outside, Phoenix's crew had grown more boisterous, their laughter and shouts carrying a sharp edge of menace. As Martha hurried away, Grace noticed how the older woman hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. Later, as Grace was preparing for her evening class, Jake returned with two others. They swaggered into the studio, reeking of alcohol and aggression. "Boss wants to talk business," Jake announced, planting himself directly in front of Grace. "Now," Grace met his gaze steadily. "I have a class starting in 15 minutes. I'll be available to talk after that." Jake's face darkened. "Wasn't a request, yoga girl. Phoenix doesn't like to be kept waiting." He reached out to grab her arm, but Grace shifted slightly, causing his hand to close on empty air. The movement was so subtle that Jake seemed confused for a moment, unsure how he had missed. "My students will be arriving soon," Grace said calmly, as if she hadn't just evaded his grasp. "I'll come to speak with Phoenix after class. Please let her know." Something in her tone made Jake hesitate. His companions shifted uncomfortably behind him, sensing something they couldn't quite identify. Grace's calm wasn't that of someone afraid to fight back. It was the tranquility of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. "You're making a mistake," Jake growled, trying to recover his intimidating demeanor. "Nobody says no to Phoenix," Grace continued, preparing. The studio, her movements measured and precise. "I'm not saying no," she replied. "I'm saying later. There's a difference." The three men left, their departure marked by muttered threats and the slamming of the studio door. Through the windows, Grace watched them return to Phoenix, gesturing animatedly as they reported her response. Phoenix's expression darkened as she listened, her eyes fixing on the studio with renewed interest. Grace knew she had just changed the dynamics of the situation. By refusing to jump at their command, she had marked herself as different from the other townspeople. It was a calculated risk, but one she had deemed necessary. The peaceful approach would only work for so long. Sometimes standing your ground was the only way to prevent further escalation. As her evening students began to arrive, Grace noticed how Phoenix's crew had positioned themselves around the studio, their presence more overtly threatening than before. They were sending a message, trying to intimidate both her and her students. But Grace had faced far worse situations, and she knew that true strength often lay in knowing when to stand firm. The sun was setting over the harbor as Grace's last student left for the day. The evening air was thick with tension, the usual peaceful sounds of the waterfront replaced by the rumble of motorcycles and the sharp laughter of Phoenix's crew. As Grace began her closing routine, she knew that a confrontation was becoming inevitable. The only question was when and on whose terms it would occur. The confrontation came sooner than expected. As Grace finished closing the studio for the night, the sound of shattering glass echoed from down the street, followed by a woman's frightened scream. Through the growing darkness, she recognized Mrs. Peterson's voice, the elderly woman who ran the flower shop next to the bookstore. Without hesitation, Grace moved toward the door, her movements fluid and purposeful. The street outside was poorly lit, the usual warm glow of storefronts dimmed by closed shutters and darkened windows. Through the gloom, she could make out a group of bikers surrounding Mrs. Peterson, who was backed against her shop's broken window display. "Please," Mrs. Peterson's voice trembled as she clutched her purse. "I've already given you everything from the register. I don't have anything else." Phoenix's crew had formed a tight semicircle around the older woman, their leather jackets gleaming. Dully in the streetlight, Jake stood at the center, his massive frame looming over Mrs. Peterson as he reached for her purse. "Let's just make sure about that, shall we?" Grace's voice cut through the night air, clear and steady. "That's enough." The group turned, surprise flickering across their faces as Grace approached. She moved with measured steps, her presence drawing their attention away from Mrs. Peterson. Jake's face split into a cruel grin as he recognized her. "Well, if it isn't the yoga teacher," he sneered. "Come to show us some stretches." His companions laughed, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in their amusement. Something about Grace's calm approach made them uneasy. "Mrs. Peterson," Grace said, her eyes never leaving Jake's face, "please go home." Her voice was gentle, but carried an authority that made the elderly woman respond immediately, slipping away from the group and hurrying down the street. Jake's expression darkened as his target escaped. "That was a mistake," he growled, turning his full attention to Grace. "You don't want to get involved in this." Grace remained perfectly still, her posture relaxed but alert. "You've made your point," she said quietly. "The town knows you're here, but terrorizing elderly women isn't necessary." "You don't get to tell us what's necessary," one of the other bikers spat, stepping forward. "Phoenix wants this town, and what Phoenix wants, Phoenix gets." Grace's eyes flickered briefly to the newcomer before returning to Jake. "There are better ways to handle this," she offered, her tone still measured. "Ways that don't involve hurting innocent people." Jake moved closer, using his height to try to intimidate her. "Maybe you need a lesson in minding your own business," he threatened, his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder. What happened next was so quick that the other bikers barely had time to register it. As Jake's hand descended, Grace shifted slightly, her movement almost imperceptible. Jake's grab met empty air, and before he could recover his balance, he found himself staggering backward, his wrist caught in a grip that felt like steel. Grace released him immediately, stepping back to her original position as if nothing had happened. Jake stumbled, shock and anger warring on his face as he realized what had occurred. His companions stared in confusion, trying to process how the yoga instructor had so easily deflected their largest member. "What the hell was that?" Jake roared, his face reddening with rage and embarrassment. He charged forward, throwing a wild punch that Grace evaded with minimal movement, letting his own momentum carry him past her. The other bikers began to spread out, forming a loose circle around Grace. She remained centered, her breathing calm and controlled as she tracked their movements. When two of them rushed her simultaneously, her response was swift and precise. A series of fluid movements left both men sprawled on the ground, more confused than hurt. Jake, recovering his balance, pulled a knife from his jacket. The blade gleamed in the streetlight as he slashed at Grace, but she was already moving. Her hand caught his wrist, and with a quick twist the knife clattered to the ground. Jake found himself face down on the pavement, his arm locked behind him in a hold that sent waves of pain through his shoulder. "I don't want to hurt any of you," Grace said quietly, maintaining the hold with minimal effort. "But this needs to stop." A slow clap cut through the tension. Phoenix emerged from the shadows, her red hair catching the dim light like flames. "Well, well," she drawled, walking closer. "Looks like our little yoga teacher has some hidden talents." Grace released Jake, who scrambled away, cursing under his breath. She turned to face Phoenix, her stance neutral but ready. The gang leader circled her slowly, evaluating this new development with calculating eyes. "You know," Phoenix mused, When Jake told me you'd refused my invitation earlier, I was annoyed. Now I'm intrigued." She stopped in front of Grace, head tilted slightly. "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Grace met her gaze steadily. "Does it matter?" Phoenix's lips curved into a predatory smile. "Oh, it matters. See, I like to know what I'm dealing with. And you—" She gestured at Grace's calm demeanor. "You're not what you seem, are you?" The tension in the air was palpable as the two women faced each other. Phoenix's crew had regrouped, nursing their bruised egos and watching their leader carefully. The street was silent, except for the distant sound of waves hitting the harbor. "Wall, last chance," Phoenix said, her voice hardening. "Join us, or things get very unpleasant for you and everyone in this town." Grace's response was quiet but firm. "I won't let you hurt these people." Phoenix's smile disappeared. "Wrong answer." She signaled to her crew, who began to close in again, this time with weapons drawn. "Take her down. Show her what happens to people who don't know their place." As the gang members moved forward, Grace remained still, her mind clear and focused. She had hoped to avoid this escalation, but sometimes peace could only be achieved through action. The skills she had spent years perfecting were about to be put to their true test, not in competition or training, but in defense of those who couldn't defend themselves. The night air crackled with tension as Phoenix's crew closed in around Grace. The streetlight cast harsh shadows across their faces, glinting off chains and knives they had drawn. Grace remained centered, her breathing steady as she assessed her opponents. These weren't trained fighters. They relied on numbers and intimidation rather than skill. The first attack came from behind, a chain whistling through the air toward her head. Grace moved with fluid precision, ducking under the strike, while simultaneously stepping sideways to avoid a knife thrust from another attacker. Her movements were economical, each one serving multiple purposes, defense and positioning combined. Seamlessly, two of the gang members rushed her simultaneously, expecting to overwhelm her with brute force. Instead, they found themselves colliding with each other as Grace pivoted between them, using their own momentum against them. There was a grace to her movements that seemed almost choreographed, yet carried deadly efficiency. "What are you waiting for?" Phoenix shouted, her voice sharp with growing frustration. "There's one of her and 10 of you!" Jake, still smarting from his earlier humiliation, charged forward with a roar. His massive fist cut through the air where Grace's head had been a split second before. She flowed around his attack like water, and suddenly he was airborne, his own force used against him. He crashed into two of his companions, sending all three sprawling across the pavement. The remaining attackers hesitated, their confidence shaken by the ease with which Grace handled their strongest member. She took advantage of their uncertainty, moving into their midst with controlled power. Her strikes were precise and measured, designed to disable rather than damage, to end the fight quickly rather than cause unnecessary harm. A knife blade slashed past her face, close enough that she could feel the air move. Grace caught the attacker's wrist, twisted, and sent him stumbling into his companions. Another came at her with a chain wrapped around his fist, swinging wildly. She stepped inside his guard, redirected his punch, and used his own weight to throw him off balance. Phoenix watched from the periphery, her expression darkening as she saw her crew being systematically dismantled. Grace's fighting style wasn't the brutal efficiency of military combat or the flashy techniques of competition martial arts. This was something else, a perfect blend of multiple disciplines adapted for real-world survival. "She's making you look like fools," Phoenix snarled, drawing a switchblade from her boot. "End this, now!" The remaining gang members attacked. As one, a coordinated rush that should have overwhelmed any single opponent. But Grace was already moving, her body flowing through their attacks like smoke. She struck pressure points and nerve clusters with surgical precision, turning their own attacks against them. Within moments, the street was littered with groaning figures, some clutching injured limbs, others simply lying still, trying to catch their breath. Phoenix's blade caught the streetlight as she stepped forward, her face twisted with rage. "Who are you?" she demanded, circling Grace warily. "Some kind of cop? Federal agent?" Grace maintained her ready stance, watching Phoenix's movement with calm attention. "Just a yoga instructor," she replied quietly, "who believes in protecting her community." Phoenix's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Right, and I'm just a motorcycle enthusiast." She lunged forward, her blade work showing far more skill than her crew's crude attacks. Grace evaded the first few strikes, studying Phoenix's technique, recognizing the prison yard fighting style mixed with formal knife training. Their engagement was a deadly dance, each woman testing the other's defenses. Phoenix was good, better than anyone else in her crew by far. But Grace was in a different league entirely. Where Phoenix's movements were aggressive and direct, Grace's were subtle and efficient. She didn't block the attack so much as redirect them, letting Phoenix wear herself out against empty air. "Stand and fight, damn you!" Phoenix snarled, frustrated by her inability to land a solid hit. She launched a complex series of strikes, the blade weaving patterns in the air as she pressed her attack. Grace chose that moment to counter. Her hand snaked out, caught Phoenix's wrist at precisely the right point, and applied pressure to the nerve cluster there. The knife clattered to the ground as Phoenix's fingers went numb. Before she could recover, Grace had turned her momentum against her, sending the gang leader sprawling. Phoenix rolled to her feet, but Grace was already there. A precise strike to the solar plexus drove the air from Phoenix's lungs, followed by a sweep that took her legs out from under her. She hit the ground hard, and before she could move, found herself locked in a hold that made any struggle both painful and futile. "It's over," Grace said quietly, maintaining the hold with minimal effort. "Take your people and leave Harbor Bay. There's nothing for you here." Phoenix struggled briefly, testing the hold, but quickly realized the futility of resistance. You think this changes anything?" she spat. "You think you can protect this whole town by yourself?" "She's not by herself," a new voice called out. Sarah Henderson stepped into the light, followed by several other townspeople. They had witnessed the fight from hiding and now emerged, standing together in solidarity. Martha from the cafe was there, along with Mr. Peterson from the bookstore and dozens of others. They formed a circle around the scene, their presence a clear message. Harbor Bay would not be intimidated. "This is our town," Martha said, her voice firm despite her age. "We take care of our own." Grace released Phoenix, stepping back, but remaining ready. The gang leader got to her feet slowly, looking around at her defeated crew, then at the determined faces of the townspeople. For the first time, uncertainty showed in her expression. "You have until morning," Grace said quietly. "After that, I stopped being gentle." Phoenix's eyes narrowed as she assessed the situation. Her crew was beaten, her own authority shaken, and the town had found its courage. She spat on the ground, then turned to her people. "Pack it up," she ordered. "This town's not worth the trouble." As the gang members limped to their vehicles, collecting weapons and wounded pride, Phoenix turned back to Grace. "This isn't over," she threatened, but there was less conviction in her voice now. Grace met her gaze steadily. "Yes, it is. You just don't know it yet." The sound of motorcycles starting up filled the night air as Phoenix's crew began to depart. The townspeople stood their ground, watching as the gang that had terrorized them for days was driven out by one woman who had dared to stand up to them. As the last bike roared away into the darkness, Sarah approached Grace. "I knew there was more to you than yoga," she said softly. "Thank you for protecting us." Grace looked around at the faces of her neighbors, seeing gratitude and newfound strength in their expressions. "This is my home, too," she replied simply. "Sometimes peace has to be protected." In the days that followed Phoenix's departure, Harbor Bay gradually returned to its peaceful rhythm. The morning fishing boats resumed their daily journeys, Martha's cafe once again filled with the aroma of fresh coffee and warm conversation, and the sound of waves replaced the roar of motorcycle engines. But something had changed in the town. A subtle shift in how the community viewed itself and how they viewed Grace. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town, though the details seemed to grow more elaborate with each telling. Some claimed Grace had single-handedly fought off 20 attackers, while others insisted she had moved so fast she seemed to disappear and reappear at will. Grace neither confirmed nor denied any of the stories, continuing her daily routine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. As autumn deepened into winter, Harbor Bay settled into a new normal. Grace's studio remained a place of peace and learning, but it had also become something more, a symbol of the town's resilience and determination to protect its own. Her students still came to learn yoga, but many now understood they were also learning something deeper about strength, balance, and the quiet power of being prepared. Grace continued to teach, to train, and to watch over her adopted home. She knew that Phoenix had been right about one thing: it wasn't over. There would always be those who sought to prey on peaceful communities, who mistook gentleness for weakness. But she also knew that true strength lay not in the ability to fight, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary, and the skill to end conflicts quickly and decisively when they arose. The sound of waves still provided the rhythm for her daily practices, and the peace she had found in Harbor Bay remained unbroken. But now it was a peace protected by knowledge, by preparation, and by a community that had learned to stand together. Grace had found her balance between the warrior and the teacher, and in doing so had helped her community find its own strength. As winter settled over Harbor Bay, bringing with it fierce Atlantic storms and quiet snowfalls, rumors began circulating. Through the coastal communities, stories spread of motorcycle gangs retreating from the area, of groups like Phoenix's crew warning others away from the small fishing town where they had met unexpected resistance. But peace, as Grace well knew, was often just a temporary state. The first warning came on a bitter December morning, carried in on the winter wind with the arrival of a stranger at Martha's cafe. He was different from Phoenix's crew, better, dressed, more controlled, but carrying the same undercurrent of threat beneath a polished exterior. Grace watched from her studio window as he spent hours sitting at the counter, asking casual questions about the town and its residents. Martha came to the studio that afternoon, her face tight with concern. "He was asking about you," she said, her hands clutching her apron, "about what happened with Phoenix's group, but something wasn't right. He wasn't just curious, he was gathering information." Grace absorbed this news with characteristic calm, though her mind was already analyzing. The implications. What exactly did he want to know? Everything. How long you've been here, your background, your daily routine. He tried to make it seem casual, but Martha shuddered slightly. He reminded me of those men in crime movies, the ones who do the planning before something bad happens. Over the next few days, more strangers appeared in Harbor Bay. They were different from Phoenix's crude intimidation tactics. These people moved with purpose, watching and noting details. They drove expensive cars instead of motorcycles, wore tailored clothes instead of leather, but their presence carried the same message of impending trouble. Sarah, whose job at the library gave her access to local news from up and down the coast, brought more disturbing information. "There's a pattern," she explained, spreading newspaper clippings across Grace's desk after closing. "Small towns like ours, all hit by organized groups. They start with motorcycle gangs like Phoenix's, and when that fails, they send in professionals." Grace studied the articles, noting the similarities. Towns that had resisted initial takeover attempts often faced more sophisticated threats. fires that couldn't be proven as arson, accidents that weren't accidents, pressure applied through legitimate-seeming business dealings until resistance crumbled. "They're part of a larger organization," Grace said quietly, recognizing the methodology. Phoenix's crew was just the first wave. Now they're sending in their real operators. The winter storms intensified, bringing howling winds and heavy snow that transformed Harbor Bay into a landscape of white. The weather drove most people indoors, leaving the streets eerily empty, except for the occasional figure hurrying through. The snow? But Grace knew they were out there, watching, planning. In her private training room, Grace increased the intensity of her preparations. She knew these new threats would be different from Phoenix's crude attacks. These would be trained professionals, people who understood patience and strategy. The skills she had developed over years of training would be tested in ways they hadn't been before. Chief Roberts visited the studio one evening, stamping snow from his boots as he entered. "We've had inquiries," he said without preamble. "Someone's trying to buy up property all along the waterfront. They're offering way above market value, but only to certain businesses. Your studio is on their list." Grace nodded, unsurprised. "They're trying to establish control legally this time. Less messy than sending in bikers. The state police are looking into it, but—" The chief spread his hands helplessly. "There's nothing illegal about making business offers, even if we know what's really behind them." The pressure began to mount, subtly but steadily. Several business owners reported receiving visits from men in expensive suits, offering to buy them out, while hinting at unfortunate consequences of refusal. The local bank suddenly became stricter about loans to certain businesses, while being surprisingly generous to others. Grace watched it all unfold with the same careful attention she had used to study opponents in combat. These were different tactics, but the same essential strategy: divide the community, isolate the resistant elements, and apply pressure until they broke. One morning, Grace arrived at her studio to find the locks had been professionally picked. Nothing was damaged or stolen, but the message was clear: they could get in whenever they wanted. She changed the locks that day, knowing it was a temporary measure at best. The next warning came in the form of a letter delivered by courier. Inside was a formal offer to purchase her studio and the apartment above it for 3 times its market value. The letter was perfectly polite, professionally written, but Grace could read the threat between the lines. Sarah found her that evening, practicing complex kata in the studio, her movements precise and focused. "They came to the library today," she said, watching Grace move through the forms. "Talked about modernization, digital archives, generous funding. Then they mentioned how unfortunate it would be if budget cuts forced staff reductions." Grace completed her sequence before responding. "They're establishing leverage points, looking for weaknesses they can exploit." "What are we going to do?" Sarah asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. Grace walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered street. The town's Christmas decorations cast multicolored reflections on the white ground, creating an almost peaceful scene. But she could see the expensive black car parked at the end of the street, its occupants watching her studio with professional patience. "We prepare," she said finally. "They're not like Phoenix's crew. They won't give us a clear target or an obvious fight. They'll come at us sideways, looking for soft spots, trying to turn us against each other. We need to be ready for a different kind of battle." Sarah nodded, understanding. The town had learned from the confrontation with Phoenix, but this new threat would require more than physical skills to combat. It would need unity, strategy, and the kind of strength that couldn't be measured in physical terms. Grace returned to her practice, her movements now incorporating techniques she hadn't used in years, skills learned in places she rarely thought about anymore. She knew the coming conflict would test not just her ability to fight, but her capacity to protect an entire community from a threat that moved in shadows rather than striking openly. The first real strike came 3 days later, and it came from an unexpected direction. Grace was in the middle of her morning class when she heard the commotion outside. Martha burst into the studio, her face flushed with anger and fear. "They're trying to shut down the cafe," she announced, her voice trembling. "Health inspectors just showed up, claiming they received anonymous complaints." Grace maintained her calm demeanor as she dismissed her class early, but her mind was already analyzing this new development. The health inspectors, she learned, were legitimate, but the timing and nature of the complaints pointed to orchestration. This was how these people operated, using legitimate systems as weapons. Throughout the day, similar scenes played out across Harbor Bay. The bookstore was visited by fire inspectors who found concerning code violations. The local fishing boats were suddenly subject to intensive safety audits. Every business that had refused to sell was facing some form of official scrutiny. Grace watched from her studio as men in expensive suits observed the proceedings from their parked cars, their satisfaction evident even at a distance. They were sending a message: "We don't need violence to break you." That evening, Grace called a meeting at her studio. The room filled with business owners and townspeople, their faces showing varying degrees of worry and determination. Martha, her cafe temporarily closed pending a follow-up inspection, sat near the front, her normally cheerful face set in grim lines. "They're trying to strangle us legally," Mr. Peterson said, his voice bitter. "Everything they're doing is technically within the law. We can't fight that." Grace stood at the front of the room, her presence calm but commanding. "That's exactly what they want us to think," she said quietly. "They're using our respect for the system against us, but systems can work both ways." Sarah stepped forward, carrying a stack of documents. "I've been researching," she announced. "Every business they've targeted has been here for at least 20 years. That means we're all covered by the town's historical preservation ordinances. Any significant changes to these properties require special approval." A murmur of interest ran through the room. Grace nodded approvingly. This was the kind of fighting she had trained for, where knowledge and strategy were as important as physical skill. "But the health violations," Martha began. "Can be appealed," Chief Roberts interrupted, standing up, "and I've made some calls. The State Attorney General's office is very interested in patterns of targeted inspections being used for business intimidation." Grace watched as hope began to replace fear in the faces around her. This was what the suited men in their expensive cars hadn't counted on, a community that could think and fight as strategically as they could. The meeting continued late into the night as they developed their plan. Each business owner shared what they knew, what pressures they were facing, what resources they had available. Grace guided the discussion with the same precision she used in physical combat, helping them identify leverage points and defensive positions. The next morning, Grace found another letter waiting at her studio. This one was different. No polite offers, just a simple message. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She posted it on her bulletin board as a reminder of what they were facing. Throughout the day, she noticed more surveillance. The men in suits had been joined by others, harder-looking individuals who made no attempt to hide their presence. They wanted to be seen, wanted to remind everyone that legal pressure could always be replaced with more direct methods. Grace modified her class schedule, starting earlier and ending later to help business owners attend, despite their ongoing battles with inspectors and regulators. She incorporated more strength and balance exercises, knowing that her students would need both physical and mental fortitude for what was coming. During the afternoon lull, she received a visitor, a well-dressed woman who introduced herself as a representative of a development corporation. Unlike the previous approaches, this one was subtle, almost friendly. "You have to understand," the woman said, sitting gracefully in the studio's small office, "this development is inevitable. The smart play is to negotiate now, while the terms are favorable. Grace met her gaze steadily. This town isn't for sale. The woman's smile never wavered. Everything's for sale, Ms. Mitchell. It's just a question of price. She stood to leave but paused at the door. And cost. Remember that some costs aren't measured in dollars. After she left, Grace noticed new faces on the street, men whose stances and watchful eyes spoke of military or law enforcement background. These weren't thugs like Phoenix's crew. These were trained professionals who understood violence as a tool rather than an emotion. Sarah arrived as dusk was falling, carrying more research. "They've done this before," she reported, spreading out papers. "Small towns up and down the coast. They start with legal pressure, then accidents start happening. Fires, break-ins, vandalism, nothing that can be proven but everyone knows." Grace studied the patterns in Sarah's research, recognizing the methodology. It was like a complex martial arts combination, each move setting up the next, all working together toward a single goal. But like any combination, it could be countered if you understood its rhythm. When two men approached the bookstore's back entrance carrying suspicious packages, they found themselves suddenly surrounded by townspeople who had emerged from seemingly nowhere. No words were exchanged, no threats made. Just the silent message that they were being watched, that this target was protected. The men retreated, but Grace knew this was just the beginning. The next day, more suited men arrived in town, their expensive cars parked strategically around the harbor. The pressure continued to mount. More inspections, more accidents, more subtle threats. Grace adapted her strategy accordingly. She taught the townspeople to work in pairs, to maintain communication, to recognize and report suspicious activities. The town became an organism, each part working to protect the whole. The suited men's frustration became evident in their escalating tactics. One morning, Grace found her studio's water supply had been mysteriously cut off. That afternoon, the electrical system developed unexplained problems. But for each attack, the town had an answer. Local plumbers and electricians working through the night to make repairs, neighbors offering space and resources to keep businesses running. Through it all, Grace maintained her regular classes, knowing that maintaining normal routines was as important as any defensive measure. But her teachings subtly evolved, incorporating lessons about balance and strength that went beyond physical poses. "Remember," she would tell her students as they moved through their poses, "true strength isn't about resisting force, it's about redirecting it. When pressure comes, don't meet it head-on. Flow around it, use it, turn it to your advantage." The suited men watched and waited, their patience beginning to show signs of wear. They had dealt with resistant towns before, but never one that adapted so quickly, that seemed to anticipate and counter their every move. One evening, as Grace locked up her studio, she noticed a new figure among the watchers, a man whose bearing and attention to detail marked him as military, probably special forces. Their eyes met briefly across the street, and she saw the recognition in his gaze. He knew what she was, just as she had identified him. The stakes were rising. They were sending in their best now, professionals who understood the kind of training Grace possessed. The next phase would be more dangerous, more challenging than anything they had faced so far. But as Grace looked around at her town, at Martha's Cafe being rebuilt by volunteer labor, at the teenagers casually patrolling, their assigned routes, at the fisherman radio network that kept everyone connected, she knew they were ready. Harbor Bay had become more than just a collection of businesses and homes. It had become a community that knew how to fight back, how to protect itself. The snow continued to fall, covering the town in its quiet blanket, but beneath that peaceful surface, a battle of wills was being waged, and Grace was teaching her most important lesson yet, that true strength lies not in the ability to strike, but in the power to endure, to adapt, and to protect what matters most. The confrontation Grace had been anticipating finally arrived. On a bitter winter morning, when the harbor was shrouded in pre-dawn fog, she was in her private training room, moving through complex kata, when she sensed rather than heard the change in the air. Years of training had honed her awareness to the point where the smallest disruptions registered like ripples in still water. The men who entered her studio moved with professional silence, their footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floor. Through the floor, Grace could feel their precise movements, 6 of them, spreading out in a standard tactical formation. These weren't the suited observers or common thugs. These were operators, trained professionals who understood the art of violence. Grace continued her kata, letting them make the first move. She heard them ascending the stairs to her private space, their movements coordinated and precise. When they breached the door, she was facing them, calm and centered. The man in the lead was the one she had noticed before, the one with military bearing. His eyes took in the training room, noting the equipment and books with professional interest. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clear authority, "we need to have a discussion." Grace remained in her ready stance, relaxed but prepared. "I assume this isn't about yoga classes." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "No, this is about understanding your position. You've caused my employers considerable inconvenience. They've sent me to resolve the situation." The other men had positioned themselves around the room, each one clearly trained in close-quarters combat. Their stance and positioning told Grace everything she needed to know about their capabilities. These were elite operators, probably former special forces or intelligence operatives. "Your employers should have done better research," Grace replied, her voice steady. "This town isn't for sale." The leader's expression hardened slightly. "Everyone has a price, Ms. Mitchell, or a breaking point, the choice of which we find is up to you." Grace saw the subtle signals passing between the men, the minute adjustments in their positioning. They were preparing to move, to demonstrate just how serious their threat was. These weren't men who made idle threats. They were here to deliver. A message written in pain and fear. "Last chance," the leader offered. "Walk away. The town will fold without you, and you know it. No one needs to get hurt here." Grace's response was simple. She shifted her stance slightly, a move so subtle that only trained eyes would recognize it as a combat position. The leader noticed, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed the situation. The first attack came from behind, a swift and professional attempt to subdue her quickly. Grace moved like water, flowing around the strike while simultaneously positioning herself to counter the follow-up attacks she knew would come. Her years of training expressed themselves in fluid motion, each movement serving multiple purposes: defense, positioning, and control. The operators were good, better than anyone she had faced in Harbor Bay so far. They moved with coordinated precision, each attack setting up the next, trying to overwhelm her with skill and numbers. But Grace had trained for exactly this kind of situation, against exactly this kind of opponent. She used the confined space to her advantage, never staying still long enough to be cornered, turning their coordinated attacks against each other. One man went down to a precise strike to a nerve cluster. Another found himself locked in a hold that left him gasping for air. The leader watched it all with professional assessment, his own movements careful and measured as he probed her defenses. He recognized her style, or rather the combination of styles that she had mastered and made her own. "Who trained you?" he asked, ducking under a strike that would have incapacitated a lesser fighter. "This isn't standard military or law enforcement." Grace didn't respond except through action, her movements becoming more focused, more precise. She had spent years learning to read opponents, to understand their patterns and weaknesses. These men were highly trained, but they fought as they had been taught. Grace fought from understanding, from principles rather than patterns. The fight moved through the training room like a deadly dance, each participant playing their part with professional skill. But gradually, inevitably, the balance shifted. One by one, the operators found themselves disabled by strikes they never saw coming, by locks they couldn't break, by a level of skill they hadn't expected to encounter. Finally, only the leader remained standing, his breathing controlled but heavy as he reassessed his opponent. The respect in his eyes was genuine now, mixed with the first hints of uncertainty. "You've made your point," he said, stepping back slightly. "But this doesn't end here. My employers don't accept failure." Grace maintained her ready stance, her breathing still calm and measured. "Then they'll have to keep failing. This is my home. These are my people. I won't let you hurt them." The leader glanced at his men, who were slowly recovering from their incapacitation. His expression was thoughtful, calculating. "You can't protect them forever. We have resources, patience. We can wait." "So can we," Grace replied. "And while you wait, we'll get stronger. Every day, every person in this town learns a little more about standing together, about fighting back. Time isn't on your side." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "We'll withdraw for now, but this isn't over." "Yes," Grace said quietly, "it is. Your employers need to understand that some things aren't for sale, some fights aren't worth the cost." The operators gathered themselves and departed with professional dignity, carrying their bruises and their message with them. Grace watched them go, knowing that this victory, while significant, was just one battle in a longer war. But as she looked out her window at the town beginning to wake up, she felt a deep sense of certainty. Harbor Bay had found its strength, not just in her abilities, but in its unity, its determination to stand together against those who would try to break it apart. The morning sun broke through the fog, casting golden light across the harbor. Grace could see Martha opening her rebuilt cafe, the fishermen preparing their boats for the day's work, the normal rhythm of town life resuming. They had all chosen to stay and fight, each in their own way, and in doing so had created something stronger than any individual could be alone. Grace returned to her training, her movements now flowing with renewed purpose. She had found her place, her people, her reason for using the skills she had spent a lifetime developing. In protecting Harbor Bay, she had found a way to be both warrior and teacher, combining strength with peace in perfect balance. If you enjoyed this inspiring story of strength, resilience, and community, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more engaging content like this. Click the notification bell to stay updated on our latest stories that showcase the extraordinary courage of ordinary people. Thank you for being part of our journey in bringing these powerful tales to life.